All right, so it's still taking a little longer than I thought, but at least we're moving through this, and I think we'll hopefully do it in about 3 videos, about 10 minutes each. So finally, what is political science? It is the science of calm, objective analysis of politics, which may or may not aid in working politicians. That's a very boring and not much to it definition. So the way I like to look at political science is to compare it to what politics is. Most people think the study of political science is the study of politics, and it's a little bit different than most people think. And I like to compare it to politics so you can see. And on this chart here, you can see the different things. On the left side column, we have what politics is. On the right side column, we have what political science is. And you can see the difference is politics is different than political science. Political science is more of the scientific approach to important questions which will eventually determine issues of maybe policy or political institutions. And you can see the differences here in the two different columns and how they would contrast each other. So I've said many times, what are these important questions? And I think what they are is I've listed a few here. Primarily, I like to go back to Aristotle a lot and talk about what is the nature of man. I think answering this question helps you understand what comes from it. I think these are the important questions that are asked at that deep, basically worldview level. And what your feelings are on these, what your thoughts are on these, will determine your philosophies, your ideologies, your opinions. What is the good? What is justice, virtue, truth? What is the best regime? What is a citizen? What is the best citizen? Who should rule? And these last two questions are very important. If you go into political science, you may teach. And one of the important aspects of political science is answering the question, who should teach and what should they teach? So, if I can just do this in 5 or 10 minutes really quick and give you a brief history of the Western political thought over the last 25 years, we'll try to do this as fast as we can. First, it basically started in ancient Greece, in antiquity, with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They were confronting opinions of philosophy. It had been around for a while, but they confronted it in a different way, where others were maybe attempting to use logic and reason. Still, there were important matters of custom and culture as part of the understanding of philosophy. Whereas Socrates began, and then Plato, and then Aristotle looked to the questions, the important questions, concepts of justice, the good, logical arguments, in a sense to completely separate them from custom and convention and say these are aspects, these are theoretical concepts that are completely absent or should be absent when studied from the concepts of custom. They are what they are. Aristotle would say that. The fact of a fact is the starting point, and that's the starting point of the discussion. Aristotle thought the good would be the what you were to live for, not just to live, but to live the good life. And he came up with the analogy of the archer with the target to aim at. We are not only supposed to live, but we're supposed to live the good life and to know what you're living for. And he said it was like having a target to shoot at. If you don't have a target, you don't know where you're going. And that was their concept. This went on for a few hundred years, and then in the Middle Ages, you have St. Augustine and St. Aquinas, who take from Plato and Aristotle especially and merge them with the ideas of Christendom. And you have this melding of antiquity and Christendom in the Middle Ages, which basically forms the foundation of Western society. It was their ideas. It was Augustine's City of God, his just war tradition. To this day, when nations go to war, they debate whether or not it is a just war, and they use Augustine's principles. And then we have the Magna Carta. In the 16th century, you have the nobility kind of requiring King Charles to sign a Magna Carta, which basically said you do not have unlimited power because you are the king or queen. Whether divine right is established in Scripture or not, that limits to the king's power are necessary, and the rule of law was important. And this was important because it was the first aspect to take from this divine right to rule and move it into government into a limited entity, which was ruled by law, not the capricious attitude of the king or queen. And then about this time, we start to have the Renaissance. And I think the important thing I'd like to bring up about the Renaissance is, Renaissance means rebirth, and we have a lot of going on in philosophy and architecture and a lot of different areas of thought that we're looking back to antiquity, back to Rome, and looking at how they thought and how they did things. The one thing that changes, though, dramatically during the Renaissance in political science is Machiavelli's realism approach to politics. Before, philosophers were generally looking at the normative approach, and the normative approach is what ought to be or what should be. What is the good? What is justice? The things Aristotle and Socrates and Plato were struggling with, and also the Middle-aged monks of Augustine and Aquinas. But Machiavelli says it's not about these questions. What it's really about is power. It's about having power and keeping power. Machiavelli's famous for saying it's good to be loved, but it's better to be feared than loved. And so now you have a realism coming about in political science, political thought. So about this time you have England, which is coming to be a world power. They had done this primarily through their economy and commerce. Adam Smith had written The Wealth of Nations, where he determined that countries were gaining economic strength not by hoarding gold, as Spain was doing maybe in the New World, but by producing things. And contracts between individual groups and people, and government stepping back and allowing economy to prosper was what was creating this little island off of Europe to become the most powerful nation in the world. And it was also the freest country in the world. And the development here obviously led to important developments in the new colonies. So a little bit after this time we start having the contractualists. We have Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, who started asking questions kind of in between the antiquity and the Middle Ages and Machiavelli, whereas they're still asking questions of justice. But now we're looking at realism as part of that. And so they start asking questions about how do governments actually evolve? Why do they evolve? Issues of rights and liberty, justification for political authority, rest in the consent of the governed, is a conclusion that Locke came to, which was basically almost word for word put into our Declaration of Independence. Hobbes' understanding was that in a state of nature where men and women were, without government, and when it was just absolutely new, was a brutish and horrible thing. And groups would come together to form alliances to protect their lives, basically. And Locke took this and continued to move forward. He would say that maybe life in a state of nature wasn't that bad. It was bad. So you still did come together. It wasn't as bad as Hobbes thought it would be. But Locke argued that the reason you come together are to protect your rights and your property. Let's say you're in a state of nature, there's no government, and you have a tree and it's an apple tree. And you take care of that tree, and you feed it, you water it, you prune it, you watch over it, and because of your work and your labor, it's produced apples. Well, those apples are yours because you've done that. And that's great in a state of nature. But what happens is people start to see those apples and they want them too. Without the ability to protect those apples, you're basically out there with no help. So you get together and again form alliances to protect your rights and your property. Rousseau would take another view that governments do come together for similar reasons, but his argument for government was the difference between the general will and the individual or particular wills of the individuals. And he would argue that the general will is more important. The difference here is that The American founders took Locke's perspective of the social contract, and European countries generally tend to take Rousseau's perspective, and that's where you can see a lot of the differences between European countries and America. I think all of this being said, I think an easy way to understand this is if you've ever watched the reality show Survivor. I think it's pretty much about the same thing. You see, they dump these people off on an island, and people have to compete, and every week somebody's voted off. And what people found, I think, as the show developed, was that you need to form alliances, and you form these alliances to protect yourself from being voted off the island. And the contractualists, really, the way governments evolve is very similar, and I think you can see how it works by watching Survivor. You can understand the contractualist. One more thinker I'd like you to know about is Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a French philosopher who was the most authoritative philosopher on democracy at the time of the founding. And one of his arguments was that democracy needed to be small to work. And it's something that the Federalists and those in favor of the Constitution would have to argue against, because the American colonies together were much too large to work in Montesquieu's view of democracy. And in Federalist Paper 10, which we'll be going over, Madison will argue why that's not necessarily true and how you can set it up so it will work. Okay, I'm going to stop right here for just a second. We've got a couple more minutes to go. I'm just going to add that to another video. This one's getting to be like over 10 minutes again. But I'll have another video, just a few more minutes, and we'll be done with this.